Today, there was a very large transaction. 16,006 Bitcoin, worth about $1 billion, was moved for a transaction fee of $1.75 across the Bitcoin network. Think about that for a second. Somebody moved $1 billion of Bitcoin across the Bitcoin blockchain, and they paid $1.75. The legacy system literally would think that's egregious. Every single middleman, every single rent seeker would want their hands in the pot if somebody was going to go move $1 billion. The bankers would want a little bit. The financial advisors would want a little bit. The platforms would want a little bit. The wire services would want a little bit. Everybody would want to get paid. You want to move $1 billion? Well, you got to pay us to do it. The Bitcoin blockchain doesn't care. It literally is going to destroy those middlemen, those rent seekers. And so to move $1 billion for a transaction fee of $1.75 is pretty damn cool. This is, as Bitcoin Magazine said here, the magic of Bitcoin. So to continue to see things like this, I think reiterate to people, this is not just about an asset. It is not only about having a finite supply in a world where there's undisciplined monetary and fiscal policy. This is a technology platform. It is a payment rail. It is superior technology. It is a decentralized, distributed network that allows for peer-to-peer transactions without asking for permission from anyone. And when you start to evaluate the software based on merit, you realize that no one can compete with it. Where else in the world can you send $1 billion for $1.75 without needing any sort of middleman and being able to do it faster than any other service? This is what Bitcoin can do. And so ultimately, I think what we're watching here is that a lot of folks are going to start opening their eyes. They're not only looking at the asset, they're also going to start to evaluate what that payment rail looks like. And as we've seen, whether it's Twitter integrating Strike, or we've seen the Lightning Network continue to grow in popularity, or things like this, where somebody moves that $1 billion for $1.75, over time, there's familiarity, there's education, and we start to get some sort of adoption that looks like mainstream adoption. It's not enough to simply just have Bitcoiners. It's not enough to simply just have the first movers. Instead, what we need is we need to have that mainstream adoption. If we then go and we look, well, what is actually happening in the market? We can see that the Bitcoin supply on exchanges is at the lowest level it has been since 2018. Now, if you think about Bitcoin exchange supply, one of the key things here is that the Bitcoin supply on the exchange is a signal that people could be ready to sell the Bitcoin. If I'm buying Bitcoin, I'm going to hold it for a long time. I'm going to go on an exchange. I'm going to convert dollars, a stable coin, or some other asset into Bitcoin. And then I'm going to withdraw the Bitcoin into my own self-custody or my own cold storage. And so taking it off of the exchange is usually a signal for long-term holders. And so the more Bitcoin that's on exchanges, the more likely there is to be sell pressure. With the click of a button, I can go ahead and I can sell my Bitcoin into the market. But if I actually go and I buy Bitcoin and I take it off the exchange, I'm adding friction to the ability to sell it in the future because I have to put it back on the exchange in order to sell it. But also what I am doing is I am signaling that I plan to hold it for a long period of time. And so 2018 was the bottom of the bear market. Of course, there was tons of Bitcoin on the exchanges at the bottom of 2018 because we had seen a ton of sell pressure. Everyone was ready to sell Bitcoin. Now, all of a sudden, as we get into the higher ends of a bull market, what we can see is that people are not ready to sell. We are at the lowest level of Bitcoin on exchanges since 2018. And so that is that signal that people are buying it, they're going to hold it, and they do not plan to sell it in the future. We know that about 85% of the supply has not been sold in the last 90 days or so. And that usually leads to that supply shock thesis. We saw in October of 2020, when we had about 85% of the supply not being sold for months on end, all of a sudden demand increases from institutions. We saw a lot of people arbing that grayscale GBTC fund. All those inflows led to a massive price appreciation, over 600%, leading into Q1 of 2021. As we sit here today, we can see that not only is there very few Bitcoin that are actually on the exchanges, we also know that a lot of the Bitcoin that is being held has not moved as well in the last few months. And then when you overlay that with the Bitcoin ETFs, and also things around interactive brokers now letting RIAs come to the market, and also players like PIMCO who have trillions of dollars, all saying, hey, we want to play in this game. That signals that there's going to be increased demand, there's a highly illiquid supply, and if history is any guide, that should lead to a massive price appreciation in the coming months. It will be very interesting to watch. Now, one of the things that is going to start to happen as the price of Bitcoin continues to go up is that people will stop talking about Bitcoin necessarily. It won't just be about, oh, that cost 3 Bitcoin. Today, 3 Bitcoin ends up being about $180,000. You don't just go to the store and spend $180,000 out of the blue. So we can't keep talking about Bitcoin. At some point, we're going to have to start talking about sats or Satoshis. And those sats end up being really hard to actually write out if we're going to use 8 decimal places. And so when you start to actually think about a sat, you can say 1 sat equals how many dollars? Or you can think of $1 equals how many sats? And so today, what we've seen is that $1 equals about 1,580 sats. The ultimate idea from most hardcore Bitcoiners is that eventually $1 will equal 1 sat. As we've seen, we continue to see that $1 equivalent in Satoshis goes down. We're moving from at one point, we were at 10 million Satoshis equaled $1. Then we were down at a million, then at 100K, then we were at 10K, then we were at 1.6K, and now we are at just under at 1,580 Satoshis. So over time, it is likely that the amount of Satoshis it will take to purchase $1 is going to continue to trend towards 1. And if we eventually reach dollar parity, where $1 equals 1 sat, Bitcoin will be at a much higher price, obviously. And so as we watch this occur, it's important to remember that as the price of Bitcoin goes up, people will come in. They will not be able to actually purchase 1 full Bitcoin. Today, it costs $60,000. That is more than a large portion of the American population makes in a single year. On top of that, what we have to remind them is not only can they buy a fraction of a Bitcoin, but they can also spend a fraction of a Bitcoin. They can spend Satoshis. And if we begin to educate people on the fractional ownership of this asset and the ability to spend those fractions of a Bitcoin, my guess is that we will slowly start to see a repricing of assets, both of goods and services, in Satoshis. It is very unlikely that somebody is going to say, hey, you can come here and you can actually purchase this piece of this good from the grocery store or this service, and it's going to cost you 0.0001 Bitcoin. No, instead, they would just list it in Satoshis. And so that ends up being the next big phase here. We already have the mainstream adoption of individuals. We now are in the institutional adoption phase where financial institutions and corporations are all jumping in. And that institutional cohort, really important. We then are just on the precipice of seeing the nation states start to adopt this, whether it's sovereign wealth funds, which we've heard Anthony Scaramucci and Kevin O'Leary talk about in the last few days, or it's nation states like El Salvador, or maybe even rumors around Brazil or others starting to actually buy the asset, hold the asset, or give the asset to their citizens. But on top of all of that, the next big phase is after the adoption, we will start pricing goods and services in Satoshis. And so it'll be very interesting to see this because on the internet, rather than have individual geographic-based assets, my guess is that we will start to see more and more pricing in Satoshis. And lastly is don't forget that this has been a long journey. This journey has been going on for literally more than a decade. It is not something that just popped up in 2017 or 2018. If we go all the way back just to 2013, about 4 years after Bitcoin actually was launched, you can see here that the Money magazine said that the Winklevoss's idea around a Bitcoin ETF was number 5 on the 20 dumbest things of 2013. Number 5, 20 dumbest things of 2013. Well, the Winklevosses, they got the last laugh. They made the infamous purchase of 210,000 Bitcoin right around that time. Seems to have turned out pretty well for them. They're both multi-billionaires. But on top of that, Eric Voorhees calling out that anyone who sold their car for $10,000 and bought Bitcoin upon seeing this now has $3 million. So you could have said in 2013, this sounds like a dumb idea. But now here we are. We have multiple ETFs trading in the market in the United States and many more abroad. And so maybe it wasn't a dumb idea. Maybe it's just that the world didn't actually understand what they were watching occur, and the Winklevosses did. So what do we think in terms of kind of where we are and how long this has been building up to? But it feels like now we're at a point where it's really hard to argue like this stuff isn't value.